Okay, so welcome to our keynote talk for today. And I wanted to introduce our two speakers, and especially our keynote speaker, John Garrigus, who we're so thrilled to have, this major historian of the Haitian Revolution, who has really pioneered the study of the free colored class. He got his education at Johns Hopkins, where so many venerable Atlanticists seem to have emerged. And he has many awards and publications, but I'll name some of them. He's a co-editor with Christopher Morris of Assumed Identities, The Meanings of Race in the Atlantic World, the editor and introduction of La Mulâtre ou la Femme comme il y a beaucoup de blanches, came out with Harmattan, and the co-editor with Laurent Dubois, Slave Revolution in the Caribbean, A History and Documents. And his most recent book is co-authored with Trevor Bernard, The Plantation Machine, Atlantic Capitalism in French Saint-Domingue and British Jamaica, 1740 to 1788. And he has won awards for outstanding research and also Professor of the Year, which I thought was really most impressive. Most of us are better at one than the other. And this, his talk today is from his forthcoming book project on poison, disease, conspiracy, and the coming of the Haitian Revolution. Before he starts, I wanted to mention that our comment will be provided by our own Stephen Bell, who's in the Department of Geography and History at UCLA. And his publications include Campanha Gaucha, a Brazilian ranching system, 1850 to 1920, and the definitive study of Aimé Bonpland, Life in Shadow, Aimé Bonpland in Southern South America, 1817 to 1858. So I'll turn things over to John Garrigus.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Robin. I wanted to thank Robin especially, but also Brian Pittman and Oliver Chen and everybody else who's working to bring this conference into being and then to transition us into this digital realm, which is safer, not as much fun, but certainly one that's nice to have the opportunity to work in this realm since we can't work in the other realm. I'm going to move now and share my screen. I've got a number of illustrations. So let me see, bring that up. Right. And then I trust everybody can see that.
Yep.
All right. Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and start. I seem to have lost my video feed here, but that's fine. That's fine as long as you guys can see me. That's good. So you see where to start here. Let me start actually by sort of setting a little contemporary context. This moment of pandemic that we're all living through now is, of course, created a whole genre of popular journalistic accounts. And I was struck at looking at some of them, or looking at all of them, all the ones that I've seen, how little attention is given to the role of animals in this history of disease. Even though we know, right, we know that all of these pandemics, at least, all the ones that I've ever read about, all have their roots in zoonotic diseases, right? Diseases that emerge in animal populations and then sort of make it into human society in one way or the other. And so I'm always struck when I see people make these historical lists of epidemics and pandemics that there's very little consideration given to the impact of animal disease. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. A series of epidemic diseases in the Caribbean that have gone pretty much unnoticed by historians, which I guess would be fine from some perspectives, except the effects of those diseases have had a huge impact and created a whole, I might argue, mythology of about the relations between enslaved people and masters. I'm sort of understanding that I'm not I'm not showing the video. So let me stop this and reconfigure. I'm going to mute just for a second. Okay, I'm back. Not able to see anybody's face in here, but I'm going to go ahead and proceed. So I want to yeah. So I'm trying to situate this talk in the largest possible context, is that the separations that we make in sort of popular culture between animal lives and animal deaths, and human lives and human deaths, is pretty artificial, as I think everybody who's tuned into this understands. And certainly in the early modern period, it's very, very problematic to think that we can understand what's happening in these early modern societies without understanding the lives and the deaths of the animals that were such an integral part of life. So the presentation I want to make here in the next 45 minutes is basically a chapter. I hope maybe an article, but certainly a chapter in a book of 5 to 6 chapters that rewrites the story known as the Mackandal conspiracy, which is a central element of the pre-revolutionary history of Saint-Domingue. So I'm not going to be talking a lot about Mackandal. I'll mention him a little bit, but I really want to focus our attention on the diseases that I argue produced the victims attributed to Mackandal and his poisons. And my emerging vision of Mackandal in no way diminishes his centrality as a figure in the evolving culture of Saint-Domingue and Haiti, but it just does change the nature of that involvement to subtract the carnage that's traditionally been attributed to him. So speaking of carnage, I start the paper with the notorious story of Nicolas Lejeune, a coffee planter in 1788 who was arrested, though not surprisingly never convicted, of murdering and torturing 2 women on his coffee plantation. Actions that he maintained were necessary because so many people and even more animals had been killed by a mysterious poisoner on that plantation. Lejeune is the subject of another chapter in my book. I'm not going to talk much about him, but the defense his father offered of Lejeune's crimes is the subtitle of the paper. He describes slave poisoning as, quote, an epidemic that can only be stopped by the most violent remedy. And that's ironic, if irony is the right word, ironic for 2 reasons. First of all, I believe it actually was an epidemic among animals being spread to people that caused the deaths that Lejeune was torturing these women to solve. And secondly, Lejeune's very metaphor, an epidemic that can only be stopped by the most violent remedy, shows us that he was keenly aware of animal epidemics, because those are the kinds of epidemics that are addressed by violent remedies. By the time he wrote those lines in 1788, the French government had slaughtered hundreds of thousands of horses, cows, and other animals in order to stem the contagions that were sweeping through the kingdom, the European territories of the kingdom. So Lejeune certainly knew about the violent remedies for animal epidemics. And of course, he wants to apply that same epidemic logic to the enslaved people on his plantation. This is 30 years after the Mackandal conspiracy, which is very much alive in Lejeune's actions and Lejeune's justification. So a little bit more context before we go much further. Of course, we're looking at Saint-Domingue, French colonial Haiti, but I'm also trying to situate it in a larger Atlantic context. Within Saint-Domingue, I'm focusing specifically on what French colonists call the Northern Plain, the area around Cape Haitian. And I want to draw our attention to the fact that this is both the gateway between Saint-Domingue and the wider Atlantic world, a gate through which hundreds of thousands of people and animals, and of course, crops and disease pass, both coming and going. But it's also the gateway between the Cibao Valley in Saint-Domingue, or the Dominican Republic, a rich livestock valley, particularly in the colonial period. And it's really the only region of Saint-Domingue, Haiti, this northern plain is the only region that is open to that valley. And so it is another door, in a way, between the Atlantic and the rest of the island, or at least the livestock producing regions of the island. So we're going to be focusing on the French side of the border here. Of course, this is the modern border. In colonial times, the Spanish claimed territory that ran here into what is today the High Haitian Plateau. And so that'll be a little bit important as we get a little bit further. So here is now the Haitian side of the border. And now let's switch to an 18th century French map, so we can sort of see things through the eyes of at least some of the contemporaries we're talking about. So up here is Cape Haitian, of course, then Cap Français. This is the rich, at least profitable anyway, sugar zone of the island. And here on the far eastern side is the Spanish border, and as you can maybe make out there, the Spanish border also runs south of these mountains. And the mountains really are the areas where we find the alleged slave poisoners. It's also the area through which most of the cattle are passing by the time we get to the era of Mackinac and thereafter. So let me just give a little more context on Saint-Domingue for those of you who aren't aware of it. This painting is kind of a French colonialist fantasy painted in 1943, but it does give us some sense of Saint-Domingue as this important port, opulent, at least for some of its inhabitants, a major nexus in the Atlantic world, and of course a huge source of profit for the French Empire and for the colonists at the apex of colonial society. That, of course, was only possible because of the massive importation of enslaved Africans throughout the 18th century, of course, far outstripping the colonial United States. And one of the things I'm trying to suggest here is that the massive trade in enslaved human bodies was mirrored by a massive trade in animal bodies. And both of those brutal trades were necessary for the profits that made Saint-Domingue the pearl of the French Antilles. So in sugar exports, in coffee exports, in the production of cotton and indigo, Saint-Domingue outranked all its rivals in the 18th century, outproducing all of the British West Indies islands combined, and producing enormous wealth for the kingdom, and especially for those elite colonial families who, by the end of the 18th century, were making more from a sugar plantation than a French noble living in Paris at the height of fashion. So Saint-Domingue is an extraordinary place. It's also an extraordinarily brutal place, and that brutality has been well studied where human beings are concerned. The animal world has been left out of that picture. So what I want to do today is kind of fill in the animal side of that picture in Saint-Domingue. But before I do that, I want to take a look at epizootic disease in the Atlantic world. Because if you're like me, and I've spent my whole career reading and teaching and writing a little bit about the 18th century Atlantic world, I had never heard even the word epizootic, a word that was coined in the 1760s to describe epidemic diseases where they apply to animals. And I had certainly never heard of the epizootic diseases depicted in this Dutch print. This is a disease called Rinderpest, one of three diseases I want to be profiling. I want to profile here in the next couple of minutes. Rinderpest is a viral infection that affects really only cows, but it has terrible, devastating effect on them, can kill 90% of a herd with no previous immunities. You might be tempted to look at Jan Smith's image here and say, well, this is one of those Dutch genre painters, gone a little bit overboard. But I've got an image a little bit later from the 19th century that suggests that scenes like this were probably quite common in the Netherlands, Germany, Northern Italy, and France, England. Not quite so sure about Spain. Central Europe, Eastern Europe are also targets. We also have other images that veterinary historians have constructed that show Rinderpest and other diseases striking France in kind of waves, often associated with continental wars that brought animals and humans from Eastern Europe and Central Europe into France and back and forth again. So Rinderpest, fortunately, was eradicated on our planet in the year 2011. Same cannot be said for the other two diseases. Another one I had never heard of, but which was quite deadly in Saint-Domingue and in Europe, was a disease called glanders, which affects horsekind. Horses, donkeys, mules, and other relatives. I'm kind of being a little easy on you with some of these illustrations because glanders has some terrible, there's some terrible images on the internet. I believe it's still an incurable disease. There's no vaccine for it at any rate, I don't believe. It's a bacterial infection whose most important characteristic is the production of infected mucus out of the horse's face before it kills them. And horses, as with Rinderpest, infect one another very rapidly. And glanders is also deadly for humans who get within slinging distance of this horse mucus. So a number of veterinarians and stable hands over in historical time have died from exposure to that mucus, though it wasn't really a serious public health issue in the 18th century. What was a serious health industry, a serious public health risk, and was really the focus, the star of my paper, the Death Star, if you will, is a disease known as anthrax. And most 21st century people, particularly in the United States, we think of anthrax as a biological weapon because of the terrible deaths of those 5 people in, was it 2001, who opened envelopes containing anthrax spores. But anthrax is in fact a disease with a long history, especially in the Western world. And it's quite different from glanders and Rinderpest in the sense that anthrax is not a disease that animals generally pass from one to another. Instead, animals acquire it by ingesting the anthrax spores, which are the anthrax bacteria that have created a kind of tough, thin film around them that allows them to survive in the soil, maybe for a dozen years, some people say as long as a century. Animals graze in anthrax-infected areas. They ingest the spores. Once inside their body, the spore activates and quickly colonizes the bloodstream and colonizes key organs and kills them. The animal can be dead within 24 hours. And one of the unusual things about this is that there's no obvious sign of illness, unlike glanders with its sort of spectacular displays of mucus. The animal seems to be healthy. It simply lays down and dies, though it's obviously in some kind of pain. Human beings can get anthrax by touching these animals, by working with their leather. And that form of anthrax is what gives the disease its name, right? This is cutaneous anthrax, where people get large black blisters, carbuncles, pustules on their skins. This is why the disease is named after a kind of coal. The French call the disease charbon, which means coal or charcoal. And the cutaneous form of anthrax is quite deadly, can kill you if you can't get modern antibiotics. But it wasn't a major public health risk in the 18th century, though many farmers probably died of it. But was a public health risk for humans was that the animals died without apparent sign of illness. So in hungry times, in Saint-Domingue, it was always a hungry time. People would see that animal, seem to be fairly healthy, and they would strip its meat and strip its leather and use them, eat the meat, and then they would get the gastrointestinal form of anthrax that had killed that animal. And they would develop a very high fever, but no specific symptoms, no blotches on the skin, but just excruciating pain as the disease colonized them, and then they would die within 24 hours. So there is a third form of anthrax that I've alluded to, that is the pneumonic form of anthrax, where people can inhale the spores. That's been the form of the disease that's been weaponized by governments starting in the 20th century. And that was not really an issue in the 18th century at any rate. So just to kind of double back on anthrax, one of the things that happens then, the way the disease is transmitted is quite geographic. The animal, as it's dying, is host to millions upon millions of bacteria. Those bacteria sink into the soil, they revert to becoming spores, and then they're carried to the surface either in times of flood, they're carried to the surface by growing plants, or they're carried to the surface when animals in a time of drought paw at the soil and pull up the roots of plants, and then they get the anthrax spores that way, and then the cycle repeats itself. So some pretty grim stuff, and certainly it was incredibly grim in the 18th century, where anthrax and rinderpest and glanders and a handful of other diseases I'm not mentioning just wreaked havoc on the agricultural economies of Europe, which is to say the entire economy of Europe, to the point that by the middle of the century, enlightened farmers, doctors, state officials, emerging economists began to pool their resources to see what could be done to not just halt the epidemics, but to stop them and understand them better. In fact, it's in the course of that attempt to understand these veterinary epidemics that we see the formation of veterinary science in France. In the early 1760s, the French monarchy establishes the first 2 veterinary schools in Europe, and very soon they become centers of research and practice for treating these epidemic diseases of animals. And they train veterinarians throughout much of continental Europe. I have to say the English and the North Americans are quite late to jump on the bandwagon of scientific of veterinary science. And so that makes it a little difficult when we want to understand how animals, whether animals in the United States or in other British territories were suffering from these diseases. In spite of that kind of myopy, that sort of focus on the French, I think there's a lot of additional circumstantial evidence that the animal diseases I'm talking about were brought to the Caribbean by the French. Now, they could have been brought from Africa. After all, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, right, were brought from Africa. And as we know, thanks to some of the scholars who may be watching right now, animals, plants, diseases, not to mention cultures, all sort of came from Africa into the New World. And yet, the livestock economies, the large animal livestock economies of Africa were configured quite differently in the Atlantic zones, especially from what we see in Atlantic Europe. So as you probably know, the scourge of trypanosomiasis, disease brought by the tsetse fly, makes it difficult to raise cattle or horses in large numbers outside of zones that are free of that insect. And so even though animals are found throughout this entire region, and even though animals were brought from Africa to the New World, they oftentimes would be brought from Atlantic islands, and so therefore not directly from areas that might have been having an African epizootic. When epizootics do come to Africa that we know about in history, it tends to be in the imperial period, specifically in the 1880s and 1890s when Rinderpest was introduced, probably into Ethiopia by the British Empire, ships coming from India, spread into northern Nigeria and across that West African cattle belt, and then down south into Portuguese Angola, South Africa, killing 90% of cattle in that region, and just having a devastating impact on the human beings, their health, their economy, their entire society. So these are Boer farmers, the descendants of Dutch settlers, Dutch colonists in the Transvaal region of South Africa, looking out on their Rinderpest stricken herds in 1896. So reminiscent of that Dutch image from 1745. So we can't rule out Africa entirely as a source of this, but it is interesting when we switch to the Caribbean and we look at a map like this and are reminded of the huge impact that African plants and people and diseases have on all these territories. It's very difficult to find evidence or epizootic disease in places like Jamaica, at least in the literature that I've looked at, in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the northern coast of Latin America, and maybe the literature will catch up and correct me. The places I'm finding evidence of epizootic disease are in the French colonies and in 2 British colonies that really are exceptions that prove the rule, because Barbados is in close commercial contact with Martinique about the time that anthrax was noted there, and Grenada, where they had a major epizootic, was just coming out of French control when the British doctors noticed this problem there. So it does look as though there's a distinct French fingerprint on anthrax and glanders and other epidemic diseases of livestock. Now, I do need to say a word or two about the United States in all this, because the literature is really pretty thin on epizootic disease in colonial North America. It's really in the 19th century when animals begin to mass together, for example, in the Civil War, or for the hog trade in the 1830s in sort of southern Ohio. That's when we begin to see a literature on epizootics in North America. So there is one critical exception to that. The only epizootic I've been able to find evidence of is an outbreak of anthrax, which occurs on the mainland, but in French Louisiana, 1735. So again, that's that French connection that is quite interesting in terms of understanding the prevalence of poison and poison mythologies in the French slave societies. Well, let's switch now to talk about animals in Saint-Domingue, who, of course, were central to this society. And as a lot of you know, and as Robin already reminded us, I mean, animals were the reason why there is a French colony in Saint-Domingue. The buccaneers of the 1600s who came to hunt the feral livestock that the Spanish had left behind, remnants of a pre-existing smuggling trade between the Spanish and the Atlantic world that the French buccaneers continued, and that the French planters would continue as well on into the 1700s. But by the time we get into the 1700s, when this watercolor was made, the plantation world had really changed the animal economy and ecology of Saint-Domingue, particularly in the northern plain. The French were still relying on animals for food and leather, and still exporting the leather as they had in buccaneer times, but increasingly they were using animals as power for transportation, but for power in the manufacturing processes, the proto-industrial manufacturing processes that were essential to the rise of Caribbean sugar. So here we see a 17th century print where oxen turn a sugar mill, and Saint-Domingue's access to cheap oxen from the Dominican Republic or Santo Domingo was a central part of its advantage as a sugar producer that I think has been really underemphasized. For planters who were sort of wealthier or in more of a hurry, as sugar planters tended to be because they had major loans that they were paying back, horses, or more likely mules, were used. A mule could turn a sugar mill something like 3 times as long as a horse at almost exactly the same pace. So implicit in this kind of industrial use of animals is a kind of brutality, a sense of working animals to death that is echoed in the specific quotes I have in the paper, if you want to read the evidence I have there. Here in the visual presentation, I'm instead looking at the images created by eyewitnesses that remind us the brutality with which humans were treated in these landscapes is kind of echoed in the way that animals were also sort of naked, unnourished, tortured. The whip is omnipresent in many of these images. Again, reminding us that when we try to understand the cruelty and suffering of humans in these societies, we can't really separate it from the cruelty and suffering imposed on animals in these societies. And to cut out one half is to really misunderstand the other half. Well, I've got a fair bit of quantitative data on livestock and people in Saint-Domingue. I'm not going to talk much about that, but I did want to sort of show this one chloropleth map, which is a density map thanks to GIS, that allows us to see that the area that I'm talking about, this northern plain, is by far the most dense concentration of animals in all of Saint-Domingue. Dense because of the presence of sugar plantations and coffee plantations that relied on mules and oxen, but also because of the Atlantic trade, and also because of the ongoing replenishment of those animals from the Dominican Republic and elsewhere, as we're going to see. So animals, as we said, were coming down the Cibao Valley, had been for centuries by the 1700s. By the middle of the century, the Spanish authorities in Santo Domingo had come to realize that, in fact, Saint-Domingue's planters were profiting far more than the Spanish were from this trade. And so they began to tax this point of entry, and the Spanish began to cross the border in other ways, including Banica, probably, that Robin talked about. But for the north plain, they began to carry them drive them through the hills and also across the mountains into Port-au-Prince. So this was the mule trade, and I've got numbers something like 20,000, maybe 30,000, sorry, not the mule trade, the oxen trade. The trade in cattle 20, 30,000 cattle coming through every year to be consumed, both in terms of energy and meat on the French side. The other kind of trade and the other kind of animal that was so essential to sugar production, as I said, was mules. The French loved their mules, particularly Atlantic Frenchmen, loved the Poitevin mule from Poitou, a very large animal, as you can see, famous in France and really throughout Europe, not only for its size, but for its vigor and for its stamina, as well as its distinctive long, shaggy coat. In the 1740s, the French tried to bring these animals to Saint-Domingue, but the first boatload landed and promptly died. And I wonder, I don't think it'll ever be possible to prove that whether these animals may have brought some of these zoonotic diseases into the colony. After the 1740s, the French began to turn entirely to other external producers in the Spanish colonial world, importing mules from Cuba, from Puerto Rico, but also from, in fact, mostly and most expensively from the northern coast of Venezuela, where again, something on the order of 10,000 mules per year might be brought out of the mainland into the Caribbean, and many of them would wind up in Saint-Domingue to be kind of used up and then replaced in the following year. So the animal trade, Atlantic animal trade, also involved horses being brought in from New England, from Rhode Island and Connecticut especially. In fact, doctors in Saint-Domingue opined at the end of the 18th century that glanders was brought in from a shipload of horses from Connecticut. But I haven't been able to find any record of that kind of disease in colonial New England, while we have ample record of glanders, the French call it la morphe, in 18th century France. So I'm inclined to think that's blaming the foreigners for a French disease. And you can see here, I've got the French animal trade kind of sketched in hypothetically, as well as the Louisiana animal trade, because that ended once the Spanish took control of Louisiana after the 7 Years' War. So a massive trade in animals as well as people made Saint-Domingue's prosperity possible, or profitability, I should say. The first epizootic I've been able to find in this colony is ironically not in the northern zone that we're mostly focusing on, but in the area around modern day Port-au-Prince. Of course, Port-au-Prince had just been founded when this disease struck, but it struck in a rich agricultural region known as the cul-de-sac plain. And in 6 weeks, planters just could not believe how many horses and mules were dying. And it's interesting that they treated this very much like an epidemic in Europe. They buried the animals deep, they imposed a quarantine, they ordered planters to sprinkle quicklime on the corpses, and they sent a doctor across the border to the Dominican town of Neiba to confer with ranchers there. And he came back with the same opinion his colleagues shared on the French side. This was an outbreak of anthrax. Late 1750, early 1751. Later in 1751, on the other side of the colony, but a side that was also linked by the animal trade to Santo Domingo, colonists in Cap Francais began to report of a frightening disease that was striking down people who bought beef from the colonial butcher. Informed consumers were avoiding beef and they were eating pork and mutton instead, because the strongest colonists who survived yellow fever and survived malaria were dying of diseases carried in the meat, which was fit only to feed dogs, they said. Then in 1755, a new butcher was appointed, and the deaths got even worse because that butcher began to get his pigs and sheep from a different source, and they were now as diseased as the cattle continued to be. People will maybe have been feeding their meat to the dogs, but now the dogs ended up dying in such great numbers that the government of the city outlawed fishing in the harbor off the city because there were so many rotting carcasses of dogs in that water that they thought the fish might be polluted as well. So that's sort of the scene before the great poison conspiracy that's attributed to Macandal. 1750, we've got anthrax. 1755, we have symptoms that seem quite consonant with what we would expect from anthrax in the food supply. Before I talk a little bit about these enslaved people who give rise to the idea of a poison conspiracy, let me just share with you the statistics that sort of prompted this whole project. So trying to understand what Mackandal was doing in his conspiracy, I began to look at the reports of the people who had reports of his victims. And the governor of Saint-Domingue, the most reliable authority I could find, said that over 10,000 livestock had been killed by Mackandal, 6,000 to 7,000 enslaved people, and a great number of whites. No one ever attaches a number to the whites, but it's interesting. You don't also find the very many prominent names of people struck down by white people struck down by this disease. So when I began to look at these numbers, I thought that doesn't seem like slave resistance to me. That seems like something quite different. So I began to look at the documents, and what I realized was that the whole idea of poison and a conspiracy really had nothing to do with Mackandal. If you read Mackandal's, there's no transcript, there was no trial, right? It was a kangaroo court, but the notes taken by Mackandal's prosecutor explicitly mentions they never found poison connected with him in any way. We'll talk about Mackandal in a minute. The man who mentioned poison and a conspiracy was a man I'm representing with this image. They called him Medor. I believe he was a West African. He was enslaved by a French doctor for some 20 years in Cap Français, up until about 1755. When the meat began to turn bad, Medor, who was a domestic worker, not a field worker in this urban household, was moved with the rest of the household to some land that the doctor's wife had inherited way out in the countryside in the mountains, here really closer to Fort Dauphin and close to the Spanish border. This was in 1757, and it was a terrible time to be enslaved, particularly in the countryside in Saint-Domingue, because in 1757 already two terrible things were happening. A horrible drought had descended on the colony, not only drying up the coffee and indigo and sugar plantings, but making it very hard for people who relied on manioc or millet or plantains to feed themselves. The enslaved people in particular were suffering. And the traditional ways in which the colony got by in times of drought was to import corn flour, salt beef, salt fish, perhaps rice. But 1757, we're 1 year into the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. And the British Navy has installed its most effective blockade ever, not only cutting commerce with France, but cutting all smuggling from North America. So it's a time of terrible famine. And there's evidence that Medor would have been suffering this terrible famine out there in the coffee hills, as well as the 30 plus people that his doctor master bought to make his coffee fortune. Medor went to his master de Lavaux and said that he had been poisoning, and then he uses that word, slaves and livestock, and was surprised that they had suddenly died. That surprise suggests to me that he wasn't trying to kill them, and that when he used the word poison, he meant something quite different. I'll talk about that in a minute. Medor told this to his master in the hope that his master would alert authorities and that they could arrest the man who had made these poisons for Medor so that they could arrest him and punish him. However, as Medor began to talk about the poisons he was giving people, he let slip that for some 20 years, he and other people in the household had been giving poisons to the master. There's no evidence that the doctor or anyone in his family was suffering, or at least was dying from these poisons. They felt they might be sick from them. But again, it seems unlikely that Medor was trying to kill his master, that he meant something different by poison. But then he went ahead to talk about a secret, what we might call a conspiracy, that he and other people had created to use these poisons against their master. So that's a fascinating subject, and I'm just going to leave you tantalized there and move on and talk about what poison meant. So Medor is the guy who gives us the idea of poison and the idea of conspiracy. But poison is a very complicated concept, as Diana Patton and others have talked about in the early modern period. In early modern French popular culture, poison was something that was associated with magic and witchcraft, as well as chemical toxins. French law and French medicine had begun to clarify and chemicalize the definition of poison in the early 18th century. And certainly that's how Medor's master, a trained doctor, would have understood the word poison. Other French people might have seen it more as a mixture of what they called maléfice, a word that both meant poison and magical spells. For people from West Africa, like Médor and like his countryman Gao, who made these substances, the French word poison would have been a synonym in a number, as it was in a number of West African languages, for words that meant not only dangerous substances, but also meant healing medicines and also meant powders and tree roots and other sorts of things. So the word poison is kind of quite easy to misunderstand, and I think that's exactly what happened with Médor's master. Médor quickly came to understand that, and he committed suicide. The French went on a kind of a witch hunt and arrested and tortured hundreds of people. They began to test the substances that those people had collected. One of the substances actually was quite a virulent poison. We can talk about that if you want later. The other poisons were absolutely non-poisonous as far as the French doctors were able to tell. They burned dozens of people at the stake, but what they were really looking for, besides specific poisons, which they never found, was they were looking for someone with the charisma to create a conspiracy. And that they found in the person of Francois Mackandal, a maroon man who had absolutely no connection to the creation of substances or medicines or the ways we might traditionally think of toxic poisons. Instead, he had created a spiritual community in the hills around the sugar plain that had such a powerful, created such a powerful bond between Mackandal and those who surrounded him that the French judges who arrested him thought, aha, this is the kind of charismatic figure we've been looking for. This is the man who's behind this whole operation. And so they convicted him of leading the poison conspiracy, though they never had any evidence of poison. And they convicted him of blasphemy, which they did have a lot of evidence of his blasphemous ways probably coming out of the Congo. That would make sense. And so Mackandal was convicted and executed in a famously botched execution depicted in a 1991 Haitian painting here. And the combination of the botched execution and his extraordinary charisma and the deep psychological impact of the poison idea upon both free and enslaved people in this society ensured the creation of a legend that existed, well, really exists until the present day. So people began to refer to slaves as Mackandal's escaped slaves, or slaves that were reputed to have healing powers or spiritual powers. And that identification of Mackandal as a kind of as a personification of African malevolence, and also, of course, at the same time of African power against the whites, existed until the time of Lejeune and, of course, into the present day. Well, let me sort of conclude here. I want to talk for about 5 more minutes about what happens after Mackandal in the realm of epizootic disease, because that's how I can be as confident as I am about this diagnosis of anthrax in the time of Mackandal. Because in the 1770s, Saint-Domingue, during the time of the War of American Independence, Saint-Domingue was struck by the same 3 forces that combined to create the myth of Mackandal the poisoner: a terrible drought, a British blockade that cut off supplies of food, and widespread epizootic disease. The difference is, now in the 1770s, we can identify the epizootic disease through the eyes of French veterinarians and French doctors and French officials who, thanks to the formation of veterinary schools about 10 years earlier, this is really cutting edge science, are able to diagnose anthrax in glanders when they read about symptoms in letters from the colony. The episode that's really central to this involved how enslaved people on the border with Santo Domingo were dealing with the lack of food. They were buying a product known as tasao from peddlers. Tasao, which I'm giving you the Spanish spelling here, is strips of beef that are dried in the sun after being soaked in lime juice and pepper. And so it's a very affordable beef jerky, very lightly cooked, which of course a lot means they're probably teeming with anthrax bacteria. And in 1776, 75 and 76, officials in Cap Français became aware that people were dying in the city by eating this very cheap beef that was being peddled because of the lack of other local food sources. Then again, so they outlawed it. They ordered that all the beef be burned. And then in 1780, the same thing began to happen again. We don't get much of a sense in the laws against this product of the death toll, but in the 1780s, one published book estimated that 15,000 people died from eating tassau and other forms of beef that were infected with this disease. So here we see a repeat of that 1751 bad beef in story from Cap Français, but this time the victims are very clearly enslaved people. At the same time, we begin to have enlightened planters. I use the term advisedly, but enlightened planters who had trained doctors and veterinarians on their estates began reporting outbreaks of anthrax, or charbon as they called it, and glanders, or la morve as the French called it, on their estates in this very region that we talked about before. So we can see the disease is clearly present. And then the French epidemiological authorities were busy at work in southwest France during this very moment, trying to tamp down that terrible epidemic there. This is the main colonial port of the kingdom. And so they begin to hear about similar symptoms in the Caribbean colonies. They send word to doctors on how to treat it. So doctors in the colony very soon in the 1770s start to advise their clients, when you think there's poison, take a look at the animals and let's look for symptoms of these diseases. One colonial doctor in 1778 founded up a little news sheet, the Gazette of Colonial Medicine, with this Latin motto. And in the early editions of the Gazette, he fulminated against planters who regarded slaves as responsible for killing livestock, when doctors and veterinarians in these specific cases had been able to easily see that the animals had died of disease or from eating a spiky plant or other sorts of things. However, planters were not interested in this perspective, and the Gazette de Medicine closed down after nine issues. In 1788, the very year of the Lejeune torture scandal, a book was published in Cap Français, studies, memoranda, and notes on epizootic disease that contained dozens and dozens of eyewitness observations by doctors and scientific amateurs of animal disease and its impact not only on animals, but on enslaved people who were eating the meat. And so, not getting into the details of that, this is all been in the paper, and I've just tried to go through and give you kind of a more animated and less specific view of the evidence that I've got here. Be happy to share the paper with anybody who's interested, with the understanding that it is still kind of in draft form. But I think the fundamental conclusion is that in order to understand what slavery was like in Saint-Domingue, what slave resistance was like, and what human existence was like, we really have to look at the lives of these non-human animals, and we have to understand the ways in which their suffering buttressed the plantation society, and we have to make them less invisible members of society as we go back and try to understand it in the past. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I don't know if we want to turn it over to Stephen.
Yes, I'm here. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
How long have I got, Robin, to make comments? I don't want to take discussion time away from John's paper.
Well, I think 15 minutes.
Yeah, let's try to do that. Well, point one, I'm not a Caribbean specialist, so in a sense, anything I'm going to say comes from, to some extent, an amateur perspective. I've worked on Brazil, Southern South America. I am familiar with a certain amount of French history. I've worked in French archives. So if I say anything that's absolutely ridiculous, bear with me. The first thing I want to say is I enjoyed the paper enormously. I learned a great deal from it. It's laid out in an integrative way, section by section, theme by theme, where you start thinking about this particularly interesting island and where it sits in a broader world. It's to some extent about Western science meets broader popular culture and belief systems that are diverse and are not necessarily coming from the same place as French culture, French science. So I always like that line of Kant's that Isaiah Berlin quoted about, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. And that's the way I think about this complex matter of the meshing of knowledge systems, or so often the lack of meshing of knowledge systems. The paper has such a very rich documentary trail to investigate where matters French are concerned. I'm taken aback by just how much fact-finding, always constrained in various ways, there was in the French colonial administrative system. And if I take the very substantial paper, the 40-odd pages, very well documented, all sorts of primary sources, and if we look at those sources in terms of an index of concentration, perhaps, if we're to geo-reference where these sources relate to, then Saint-Domingue looked like a very extraordinary place indeed. So one can, as John has done, try to look at the evolution of thinking about specific topics, about livestock diseases above all. And then we set that alongside the knowledges that have been brought across the Atlantic from Africa, which are a very different matter in terms of how we're going to access those. And also there's a matter of popular beliefs on the ground in this island of Saint-Domingue. But it's a paper that takes a truly integrative and truly Atlantic approach, and it's very welcome for that. I also, as I read through it, was thinking again and again about food systems. That's not the way this is set up, and I understand that, but it occurred to me that food systems could be a good alternative lens. Looking at food systemically could be a good alternative lens for looking at things and another way of organizing the material. I'd like particularly, and this is just maybe my ignorance, to know more about the foodways of the enslaved. I, who worked on ranching in Southern South America, have never been used to thinking of salt beef or tasajo as being something problematical, but I also know nothing about salt beef that's prepared with lime juice. This is a Caribbean element. It's something new. I think of salt beef as being a compact, transportable form of high-protein food that was coming from Southern South America to feed slave populations in various parts of the plantation complex, and was in concert with salt cod that was coming down from the North Atlantic. In this particular instance, the quality or the character of some of that sun-dried jerky coming from Saint-Domingue is very problematical indeed, and I just wondered, where does this business of salt beef sit generally? How much are there regular imports for plantation food coming long distance? Those things will be interrupted by politics of the seas at various times. I understand that. But to what extent is there already a long distance trade in this? And to what extent is it something that's supplied locally on the island from the Spanish areas? I also, my head started getting obsessed a little bit by meat. You know, you never want to eat meat after you finish the paper. I don't mean that, but how much meat was in consumption, even at the best of times, not just in the Caribbean, but also in the metropolitan nation of France. My sense is that France in the 18th century is still very bound up with a cereal-based diet and things that I have read. So, you know, even at the best of times, all things going well, I don't know how much meat's available. The nature of islands has consequences, it seems to me. I'm fascinated by that. There are elements of possibility of controlled colonial experiments on islands. I was interested to read that botanists were sent out to search for flora that could be used to produce poisons across the island. Can't imagine that was a readily a project that was easy to realize. But the fact that you could even hold it as an objective, how would you have done that in, say, the backlands of Louisiana or in Brazil? There's something, to my way of thinking, rather special about the concentration of life and space within relatively limited areas on islands. I know when I say that these islands are large, sometimes large islands in the Caribbean, some of them, but still, compared with some other parts of this sort of broader complex where livestock are coming from and other elements are drawn, there's something about scale that is interesting to me. At times, the paper traces in words the importance of the physical environment, the importance of even the physical geography. And as I read about Cap Français, I began to think immediately about the geography of vectors, that not all places are equal in their significance, and this has to be teased out. We're dealing with areas of great complexity in terms of livestock import networks. Quite a number of locations are involved in all of this. And I start thinking about the possibility of mapping some of these things at multiple scales. And I was delighted that when I saw the PowerPoint presentation, John's been going down that road. Some of the maps are perhaps the sort of Donald Meinig, relatively crude sort of indicators of direction type of map. But others, drawing from quantitative data, I just find the power of choropleth mapping, which, you know, kind of regarded as old hat. People don't, I myself have done it earlier in certain studies when I worked on ranching in southern Brazil, and you map out census data in a relational way, out jump patterns, and patterns have to be explained. It's really very dramatic that you see that around Cap Français, something is distinctive is going on. I found that tremendously helpful. Historiographically, we're also interested here in the evolution of lines of authority. That's most interesting, what's going on in France itself, what's going on in terms of colonial science. It's pretty interesting to me that there are individuals with medical knowledge who are conducting autopsies and describing what they find in ways that are spectacularly, maybe that's not the right word, but very close to the first scientific definition of what we expect to see with anthrax. So you've got this business of lines of authority, traceable in terms of the French through archives to a good degree. Issues of lines of authority in terms of things drawn from the African continent present on the ground in the Caribbean, I suspect would are elusive in some ways. Also, the sort of history and geography of the matter of trust and the breakdown of this is very important and very powerful. The paper starts with Nicolas Lejeune. It's a sort of very extreme example of cruelty, of mismanagement of things. I suppose, going back to that Kant thought again about the crooked timber of humanity, even slave systems are part of humanity, whether we like it or not. We can't explain away their existence. And on the ground, beyond what we know about through written sources, if we were to speculate, there must at times perhaps have been some sharing of knowledge about conundrums of why things are happening. The paper makes the point that very well that all sorts of different factors are at play, but environmental change is definitely one of these factors. And I like very much in the conclusion the reminding of us that environmental change is not always, you know, flood and fire, dramatic matters, but the slower processes that are occasioned by the agency of people. A very different historical instance in the Americas would be to think about some of the writing about the Amazon and pre-Columbian peoples. Everyone wants drama, but when you start thinking about people doing things for extended periods, the consequences can be pretty massive. In a place like Saint-Domingue, we're not talking about millennia here, we're talking about rather constrained historical periods, but there's still a heck of a lot involved in this. From a historical geographical perspective, I'm very interested in what is the significance of land use change as people reassess physical resources. The French come in, their sense of what to do with an economy is different from that ranching-based Spanish-linked economy that was there before. A very minor point that links into some of my own research just somewhere, the colonial version of France's anti-poisoning law. Slaves were not to seek to cure any illnesses with the exception of snake bites. Isn't it fascinating that there are always exceptions where alternative knowledge to Western sciences are welcome? Snake bites seems to be one of them. When I wrote about Aimé Bonpland, when he was a captive in Paraguay for 10 years, one of his workers was bitten by a snake. He, as a French-educated medical authority and botanist, and somebody whose family, by the way, had capital invested in Saint-Domingue, was born in La Rochelle. He normally was a kind of a waspish character, serving on medical tribunals, giving a minority opinion that the Spanish-educated medical authorities aren't getting it right. This is what they should be doing. But the one time in his entire medical records they came across where he was stumped and stood aside and let the curandero come in and address something was a snake bite. Anyway, no, snake bite has nothing to do with animal disease here. But I am interested in, I suppose what I'm getting at is no matter how administrators, cultures view other cultures, start laying down prohibitions about who can do what, there are elements of life that slip through the cracks. At the very end of the paper, or towards the end, John quotes from a medical authority coming out of the British Caribbean who served in French colonies too, I think, if I remember rightly, as an inoculator, Simeon Warlock, who said, poisons are like ghosts. The more enlightened one is, the less one sees them. And I thought, yes, you know, one has this maybe sense of, with growing, in inverted commas, enlightenment about things, superstition, it can be pushed into the background. Then I started thinking about coronavirus in 2020, where even the most educated authorities keep making endless references to this thing, a silent enemy, and the tendency to scapegoat continues with us. So in terms of linking our past and present in some kind of dialectic, I think they are. But what I really want to say overall is how much I very much enjoyed this paper that takes one part of the Caribbean, a very important part in economic terms, in terms of movement of humanity in an enforced way. And I often like to say to students that if you don't know what you want to work on, get hold of a map, Queen Victoria-like, turn around, stick your finger in the map somewhere and say, what was going on in terms of land and society in that particular part of the globe? And before very long, there will be ramifications that extend from the local scene over a wide variety of historical and geographical scales. So kudos. I was very, very happy with this paper. Learned a lot from it. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for the comment. I wanted to mention that the audience should give their questions through the Q&A portal. I don't see any, but I'm not sure people are aware of the fact that they can do that. So, so please submit your questions on the Q&A portal, on the chat function. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for some questions, are there any from our group, from the panelists?
I had a quick question. Sorry, I don't. You were talking about piles and piles of dead cattle and dead livestock, and it was reminding me of how in the British Caribbean there's this phenomenon called plague hunger, where enslaved people actually dig up the carcasses of diseased animals and eat them, and it's kind of a major problem that is eventually kind of part of the evidence of abolition in British Parliament. So I was kind of curious, is there any evidence or sort of narratives of plague hunger in the French Atlantic or French Caribbean context?
Oh, wait, I think, oops. Hold on. John, you're muted here.
There we go.
Okay, there we go.
Back? Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. What you guys heard was really quite like a parallel vision of the paper the written paper, animated primarily by the visual sources that I was able to find. So the paper is actually full of those kind of plague hunger illustrations. Some really difficult stuff to read about people keeping rotten meat in their huts, about digging up animals, about fishing animals out of the rivers, just about the difficulty of hiding diseased meat from people who are starving, and including even cases where people know they shouldn't be eaten, that the animals are diseased, and the enslaved man says to the doctor, "Well, but I ate a part of the animal that wasn't diseased." So I mean, there's this incredible hunger, which, as some other scholars have suggested, was, I think you could argue, deliberately engineered by the combination of planter selfishness and by the mercantilistic designs of the French Empire, right? No free trade in food except in times of crisis. Planters doing their best to skate a very, very fine line between buying sufficient food and growing food locally, which made it susceptible to disease. So hunger was a huge problem, and it is kind of strange, as Stephen was saying, to see meat become such a focus of consumption in a world that we're used to thinking of as primarily vegetarian. But we do know that in 18th century France, part of the industrious revolution, right, the rising consumer society in Europe is growing consumption of meat, which is why France is involved in a trans-European cattle trade. Northern Italy is involved in the same thing. When the Austrians take over the plains of Hungary from the Ottomans in the 1680s, that opens up a massive source of cattle that flow into southern Germany and then into northern Italy, and from then on into France. And so French had attitudes about meat. Don't really know as much about the African attitudes, but the French really had an attitude that sick people need meat, and people who are doing hard work need meat. And so planters believed that meat was not so much a luxury for their slaves, but a necessity. It might often be very poor quality meat. And the tassau, I mean, if you read accounts of Havana, right, in the 19th century, when that tassau coming in was from Argentina, they talk about the stink of tassau, right, in the parts of Havana where enslaved people live. I mean, tassau is kind of, my understanding of it is it's the lowest of the low in terms of forms of beef, like something that maybe only the poorest people would eat, because it's come so far and it's been so sort of poorly treated. And yeah, so.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
I was very surprised when I was, working on the cattle trade from Saint-Domingue. I was surprised that, you know, beef was imported partly as a food for slaves, because I thought that, you know, I thought that slaves in most parts of the Caribbean were not given beef, but it sounds like so I wanted to follow up on that in terms of this issue around foodways, and because that really surprised me. And I also wanted to mention, we had another Atlantic colloquium this fall by Manuel Covo, who's working, he has this wonderful argument about how it was the lack of access to flour that may have been a big issue in the Haitian Revolution. So I think that there's a new food history of Saint-Domingue that's percolating up here. It's very interesting. But I also wanted to ask you about, if you could say a little bit more about the poison mythologies, which I found fascinating in your talk.
Yeah, well, let me talk a little bit about. I really am not sure who was eating the beef, but I know that salt beef was a major import in Saint-Domingue, so much so that the French in various times would extend permission for the importation of salt beef from Ireland, which they were generally quite loath to give foreign countries that opportunity. So there was a perception that beef was that salted beef was a really important commodity. So I haven't actually seen it specifically mentioned as something for slaves to eat, but it is quite important. The question of wheat is really important, and I have to say, what I'm doing is really a follow-up on a chapter in Plantation Machine, when Trevor and I talked about Mackandal and Tacky's revolt, which of course occurred at exactly the same moment in the middle of the 7 Years' Wars, as Vince Brown says. And in that half of that chapter, I actually argued for a different cause, because I became aware, researching that wheat was also really problematic. And the French were having a huge problem keeping the wheat that they sent across the Atlantic, keeping it healthy. Mm-hmm. And that they were constantly having cases where the wheat had gone bad and people were dying from it. But as a number of people, David Gagas and others pointed out to me, enslaved Africans didn't really eat wheat. And certainly livestock did not eat wheat. And so I was kind of forced to go back and push this a little bit further. But wheat is another problem, but it's really a white people's problem, if I can say that in Saint-Domingue, because they're the ones who are addicted to their bread. So yeah, the poison mythology is really powerful. All throughout the 18th century after Mackandal, the myth or the idea, just the specter of another Mackandal arising is what, for example, when the French form a free colored military corps, one of the arguments that is made for that is that if another Mackandal arises, we need to be prepared and have the free men of color on our side. So it's constantly coming up, the idea that escaped slaves are Mackandals, something you see if you go to the Marinage website. I think it's marinage.info. You can search through the digitized versions of French Marinage advertisements in Saint-Domingue and search for the word Mackandal. You'll see that Lejeune had an escaped slave that he said was a Mackandal, that he was looking for when all this stuff happened. So Mackandal becomes quite identified with all this. And yet at the same time, to go to Stephen's point, French colonists are keenly aware that African healers have got some real powers. That Africans have ways of healing that are more effective for snakebite, which is a big problem in Martinique, but other diseases as well. And so even though there are laws against slave healers, planters are turning to enslaved people for healing time and time again, because the efficacy of those cures is, well, certainly as high as the French medicine of the time, which is pretty abominable.
I have a quick question for John, if I could jump in.
Yeah, hi.
May I? Hey, John, good to see you. So you're talking about misattribution of causation, right? There are these diseases going on that were unbeknownst to the colonial regime, and then slaves were blamed for it. So I'm curious if you could speak, even if it's in a speculative manner, to what degree did the misattribution of these cases to the slaves exacerbate social tensions in Saint-Domingue that then were somehow causative to the kind of percolation of tension that then resulted in eventually Haitian Revolution? On the flip side of that, that's, I guess, looking at the downward pressure. To what degree did the attribution of the poisoning to people like Mackandal or slave poisoners embolden the enslaved right? So to what degree could you say that in the decades leading up to the explosion of the Haitian Revolution in 1791, have a causation that was actually rooted in disease, like you've pointed out? And it was a fascinating paper. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chaz. I'd be happy to send you a draft of the paper, because I do talk about that. At the end, I say, you know, was some of the power that quasi legendary figures like Boukman or Cecile Fadiman, the power that they have to inspire enslaved people was I just raised that same question, was part of that authority that spiritual leaders had coming out of the enormous power of the Makandal myth. I mean, here was an African man who struck terror in the hearts of French colonists, and those colonists were never able to solve that case. And so I think that certainly did embolden the slaves, and the way it's emboldened, you know, the way it's inspired a whole historiography. Look for Makandal on the internet. Right? There's a whole, you know, the Makandal myth is alive and well for very good reasons, right? Because it provides a personification of the power of African culture to inspire and fight back that unfortunately is kind of missing in the pre-revolutionary historiography, anyway, of Saint-Domingue. So that's really important. I do think that the slave poison idea caused tensions, and you know, I mean, the 7 Years' War, in my view, is like such a turning point for Saint-Domingue. Now I'm wondering, is this idea that people were becoming free because of the use of poisons, is that part of why the French began to crack down on free people of color in this, of course, very same period, the very years after that? I haven't seen much contemporary discussion of that, but certainly the society was already fragmented by slavery and racism, cracks even more under the pressure of war and famine and this poison idea.
Other comments, questions? Don't forget, anybody can use the chat function to ask a question. Any of the attendees.
I have a question myself, and I think there's a few questions in the Q&A section, Robin, not the chat section. My question, just kind of more structurally, quickly, is a lot of the first panel, I know for the second panel, a lot of the discussion is going to be on animal agency and animal consciousness. I was wondering, in kind of even in the studies of Rinderpest in Africa or anthrax, or have you come across evidence in the written record of animals making any kind of choices within their herds to avoid outbreaks? Have you noticed anything that people are writing about animals separating themselves, or to any extent animals having that agency to push the confines of their controllers, their masters, whatever they be, in order to avoid disease? Are animals having the agency to understand the disease enough or death enough around them to try and escape it in some sense? And I know that's probably a no, but I was wondering if there's anything you've come across at all.
Well, it is a no, but I mean, it certainly is something I want to go back and look for. I mean, the problem with anthrax is it's so hard to understand. Animals are just doing what would be normal, right? They're grazing in a field, and they have no way. Well, I mean, they might understand that somebody else had died in that spot, that it might be avoided, but that doesn't seem to be what they do. The French have this. The French call this les champs maudits, the cursed fields. There are just corners of fields, you know, where animals go over there to graze and they drop dead. And then they gradually figure out, oh, that's because that's where other animals drop dead. But it takes the humans a while to understand that causality. But yeah, it certainly would be interesting to you know, I guess the problem is my sources are so instrumentalist, right, about animals. And the animals are simply there to be used up. And I was trying to draw that parallel between the way humans and animals are used up in this plantation machine. And so there's horses, I guess, are an exception to that. People do name horses and prize horses, but I haven't even seen any evidence of people prizing dogs. the way they might in 18th century France. So then to actually see them attributing agency to those animals, or understanding what agency that the animals might be having in reality, it's something I haven't seen. But thank you for reminding me to keep an eye out for that. That would be amazing.
Well, now that I properly opened the Q&A, I've discovered a whole bunch of questions.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see this, John, but Alexa Isfahani would like a copy of your paper.
Okay.
Molineka says, eyewitness in the 17th, 18th century is not always what we might imagine it being today. Could you talk more about the production of the contemporary images that you're employing as evidence of the presence of animals and their use in Saint-Domingue?
Yeah. I mean, these watercolor images that planners contracted were oftentimes done by men who were cartographers. They were military engineers who had studied cartography, and the French were, after 1760, very much mapped. That's why L'Escalier was in Saint-Domingue, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was there to make a map of the route across the island. And so these cartographers, these engineers, will hire themselves out and paint pictures of animals. Like the one that was kind of in green was done that way. I've been struck just by the way in which those images portray the cruelty to humans. Is just extraordinary. The cover of Plantation Machine, the dust jacket, has an image like that. That's actually painted as a gift. Oh, it's painted actually as a commission for the man who owns the plantation in France. To me, it looks like an anti-slavery image because the human suffering is so clear. And there's also a beautiful sight of how much better the horses are doing in that image of a woman being drawn by a carriage. And then there are two Africans with collars on and cowering in the corner. And yet it's actually done as kind of by a man who later bought his own plantation and bought his own slaves. So I think it's a kind of a cold view of the instrumentality or the capital necessary for a plantation. The large overview is a scene of a plantation very close to where Lejeune was that shows all phases of life on the plantation. So it shows black and white people doing different things in different states of garb, and then animals doing different sorts of things as well. So I think it's really about the wealth and power of the plantation owner. And that's really what they're trying to maintain. But there's also an image in the very front of that of a man wearing what looks to me like a Native American Plains Indian headdress.
Oh.
So it's not entirely clear to me, how to fit that into art history or the visual reference of the artists.
So we have a couple of questions from Camille, and Camille is in France and it's very late. So I'm going to jump the queue and go back to Elizabeth after Camille.
Okay.
She's also working on this subject. She has several questions, but about the law about tasajo, why do you think it was directly targeted? And also, do you think there is a link between the increase of epizooties in the French colonies because the life conditions for cattle were worse than there compared to other colonies?
I do. I think that, let me see, I think the tasajo, people are pretty clear about the impact of tasajo, even though people who criticize the trade in tasajo are also people who want to see free trade in meat. So they want to have the ability to import cheaper meat from the mainland, North and South America. So there's definitely a political agenda behind criticizing Dominican meat and portraying Dominican meat as tainted. Yet I also think it's pretty clear that the Dominicans had an anthrax problem, which was probably deposited in their lap by the French, even though it's not entirely clear. So there's some fascinating molecular studies of anthrax, right, which flourished after the horrible poisoning, and people have tried to trace the molecular history, the genetic history of anthrax. And one group of French scholars has in fact established a link between North American strains of anthrax and strains of anthrax found in France. So there's a big debate among people who say that anthrax came over across the Bering Strait long before Columbus. I do think that, and contemporaries thought this as well, that animals were treated so badly, so there was such little attention to their food, no attention to covering them in the rain or any kind of structures to protect them from the weather, that animals were extremely vulnerable to disease. And vulnerable to the weather, sources of water. I mean, the animals drank salt water oftentimes. Contemporaries from France are struck by that. So I do think that was an issue.
Elizabeth Landers asks, how do you see French popular beliefs about poisoning intersect with enslaved understandings of these allegations or its potential threat?
I think that in French popular culture, that I think actually French peasants probably saw poison very similar to the way many African people might have seen poison in the 18th century, which was that there was a kind of a spiritual malevolence there that, I mean, there are many cases of French shepherds being arrested and executed for poisoning the flocks of sheep and horses and cattle that they were hired to protect. So people definitely saw poison as an expression of social imbalance and social antagonism.
Mm-hmm.
And people in France, like people I'm sure in Africa, went to their priests when their animals were struck with diseases, particularly epizootic diseases, because these things were so mysterious. The animals appeared to be so healthy before they died. And so I think there actually is a lot of overlap. It was Médor's bad fortune to have a master who was trained in the latest French medical techniques, who understood poison not as malefice, which is the sort of medieval word that people use, malefice and benefice, but would have understood it as just a toxic substance. And so that particular French colonist had a very clear understanding, I would say misunderstanding of Médor's use of the word poison. Another colonist might have understood it more broadly than that particular man did.
So there's a bunch of questions. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them, but let me continue. I'm interested, this is from Nikisha. I'm interested in the discourse around the diseased animals and the supposedly poisoning slaves. Was there any ways in which the accused slaves were animalized or the dead animals were racialized in writing about them? In so much as the treatment of slaves and animals overlapped with one another, I wonder if the language mimicked that reality.
Yeah, slaves are animalized. Of course, I mean, slaves are animalized at every turn in Saint-Domingue. The people I've been mostly reading, to be honest, have been the doctors who are trying to draw a line between the enslaved people and the animals. And they're trying to, in a way, one doctor says, if I hadn't cured this woman of what was actually a common disease, 9 people would have been burned at the stake because everyone else thought it was poison. So the sources I'm reading are really trying to separate the two, even though these doctors are certainly pro-slavery, they're trying to emphasize the humanity of the slaves. But I just see these as societies where enslaved people were instruments and animals were instruments. And so in that sense, they were both forms of capital, even though the humanity of enslaved people might have been recognized from time to time. In day-to-day treatment, both groups were kind of equivalent in the eyes of many of these colonists.
We're supposed to finish at this time, but there's still some questions. Could we steal a few minutes from the next panel or push the panel back so we can answer a few more questions? Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, that works for me.
It works? Okay, so Kirsten Mallon Andrews asks, thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm fascinated by these blurred lines between poison, disease, and human-animal relations, as well as the geographies of blame that they seem to have engendered. Do you see these histories shaping understandings of more recent epidemic events on the island? I'm thinking of the cholera outbreak or the dust from the Sahara that is often blamed for seasonal flu symptoms and maladies.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mentioned the cholera outbreak at the end because I mean the history of Haiti does have these spectacular disasters, environmental disasters and medical disasters that we know about. I haven't really thought of that. I mean, I am thinking about the geographies of blame, whether to blame the French or to blame, I guess, to blame North America for the diseases. But I'll have to think about it. That's a really fascinating question. I would like to tie this paper up to these more current issues, but I just haven't really had a chance to think about it. Thank you for pointing me in that direction.
Okay, so Yari Perez Mena. Hello, could you say a little about how the medical scientific information being generated as a result of encountering disease in Saint-Domingue was reflected or not in period medical or veterinary literature back in Europe? Was it integrated into more general considerations, or was it perhaps discussed as something relevant only to non-European settings?
No, it was definitely part of mainstream literature. Félix Vic Dazir is sort of the father of comparative anatomy in France and the father of epidemiology. For example, includes letters from Saint-Domingue in his accounts of animal disease. There was the brother of an important French official was sent to observe epizootics in Guadeloupe, and his very detailed account of how he realized that people and animals were dying of the same diseases in Guadeloupe is reprinted widely in French medical literature as well. So these diseases were such a threat to the French European economy that any kind of evidence about the parameters of disease and infection was very welcome. And so all well-documented cases that I've seen from Saint-Domingue reappear in the continental literature as well.
Okay. Let's see. I'm going to jump to Camille because I think she may have be going to bed soon. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. Why the livres de couleur were targeted?
Well, that's just something that I've noticed, that the rising tensions around poison also circulate at the same time as rising racism, classifying biracial people as former slaves inaccurately. Many of them were freeborn people, and this is something I wrote a book about. And I'm just starting to notice as I get deeper into this poison literature that many of these things are happening around the same time. And the Médor conspiracy is really a conspiracy about how to medicate the master so that he or she will initiate emancipation. It's not about killing the master. It's pretty clear from the testimony that when the master dies, the enslaved person's life gets much harder, because the key to their manumission is going to be somehow engineering a relationship that's strong enough that the master will go through the elaborate procedures necessary to free them. So there definitely is a connection between manumission, at least in the mind of enslaved people, but I haven't really teased that out. And I've mostly looked at the livres de couleur, who are the wealthy freeborn people who are themselves slave owners. So what we're really talking about here are a very different kind of livres de couleur, who are in fact affranchis. That is, they are enslaved people who have been set free. And they're the ones who, according to the testimony of Médor and others, are claiming that they used drugs on their master to obtain their freedom.
Fascinating. Methodologically, could you speak about the process of tracking epidemiology as opposed to commodities?
Process of tracking epidemiology. I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but of course in epidemiology I'm relying on this French documentary, a record which is both published and also unpublished, and this rising concern with the lack of available food and the death of animals that then get sidetracked around the poison myth. And then there's a parallel literature that people like Bertie Mandelbaum have talked about, which is the literature on supplying Saint-Domingue with food in the 18th century. And she's the one that's pointed out, I think very astutely, that there was a kind of a engineered famine. It was kind of deliberate choice by government and private leaders to keep Saint-Domingue teetering on the verge of famine, because that produced the most profit. It was kind of a political compromise between planners and metropolitan merchants. And the people who were caught in the middle, of course, were the animals and the people in the colony who suffered.
Okay, so we have, I think we have 2 questions, and then we should call it a day. Hi, Robin. It's Rodrigo Bulamar from Brazil. I have a question for Professor Garrigus. First, thank you for this great presentation. I'd be interested in reading the paper. My question is related to the possibility of enslaved people having animals and through them experiencing forms of relative autonomy inside the plantation.
Right, yeah. I've been looking for cases where enslaved people had hogs and Creole pigs, of course, famously in Haiti, as a symbol of autonomy and wealth, and poultry. And I haven't found anybody talking about that, because I assume that enslaved people's animals would be dying just the way the master's animals are dying in these kind of outbreaks. But of course, the masters aren't really concerned about the Creole pigs or the guinea hens or any of that stuff dying. So that's a really fascinating question. I've got to keep my eyes open for any mention of that. Thank you.
Okay, and then a final question. I can't resist asking for your thoughts about poisons, pandemics, violence, and animals in the current moment, says Alexa Isfahani.
Okay, yeah, well, it's certainly tempting to talk about those wet markets in China, and I'm completely ignorant of the cultural and medical benefits that people believe they get from that kind of relationship with the wild animal world in China. It's a culture I haven't studied and I'm not familiar with, so I'm on the one hand, I have strong feelings about it, and I kind of feel as a scholar, it's really not my place to comment on it. But I think the world has to look closely at the way we medicate animals and the way we interact with animals and the way we consume them, whether it's in our country or in other countries around the world. And I think our country's got a long way to go in terms of the way we treat animals and the way we medicate and interact with them and shorten their lives. So I'll leave it there, but thanks for the question.
Great. So one last comment, and then I think we can close this panel. But Bridget Fielder has written about enslaved people having companion animals, says Alexa. So, well, I think we have to really give a warm round of applause to this fabulous panel, and with a wonderful paper and a wonderful comment. And just thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, John, for coming to UCLA.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We appreciate everybody's comments. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Yep.